Well, welcome to the IISS this afternoon for our discussion meeting on political Islam and issues at stake in the Bangladesh elections. For purposes of the audio recording taking place, my name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the IISS. This discussion today could not be more timely. General elections in Bangladesh are to take place a month from today, on the 5th of January 2014. But strikes and violent protests threaten to destabilize Bangladesh ahead of these elections. In the last 5 weeks, for example, there have already been over 50 people killed and hundreds injured in violent protests. Last month, an all-party interim government headed by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League was formed to oversee the elections. These elections are being boycotted by the main opposition party, the Bangladesh National Party, led by arch-rival and former Premier Khaleda Zia. The BNP demands polls be held under a neutral, non-party caretaker government, a constitutional provision that was annulled in June 2011. At the same time, the Election Commission maintains that the Jamaat-e-Islami, an influential Islamist party, traditionally an ally of the BNP, is ineligible to contest the polls in line with a court order. Bangladesh's International Crimes Tribunal has also sentenced past Jamaat leaders to death due to war crimes committed during the Bangladesh Liberation War. What therefore are the likely outcomes of the current political deadlock? What is the way forward for holding fair elections in Bangladesh? Is the current ideological clash between secular Bengalis and Islamists a make-or-break struggle for the identity of the world's fourth largest Muslim country? To discuss these and related issues, I am delighted to introduce our two panelists this morning. Frances Harrison, to my right, is a writer and foreign correspondent. She recently wrote a study on political Islam and the elections in Bangladesh on behalf of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, where she was a visiting research fellow. She's a former BBC correspondent in Bangladesh as well as in several other countries. Kamal Ahmed, to my left, works as a freelance journalist based in London and is a regular contributor to Bangladesh's top Bangla daily Pratham Alo. He has spent 14 years in the BBC in various areas of journalism and has recently returned from Dhaka. I'd like to begin the session by inviting Frances to speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, followed by Kamal, and then we'll break for the discussion and question and answer session. Frances, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So my role in this is that, of course, I used to live in Bangladesh a long time ago and work for the BBC, but I recently went at the earlier part of this year twice to Bangladesh to research a book or a short paper on political Islam and the elections. And I think if you look at how that's already gone out of date, you'll see how fast things move in Bangladesh. And that's another reason why I really asked Kamal to come along too, to answer questions about what's happening on the ground, because he's just literally come back a couple of days ago from Bangladesh. But I'll tell you a bit about some of the things I found and some of the things I couldn't find, which I think are also revealing. Well, as you know, elections are due to happen on the 5th of January without any of the main opposition parties taking part. And today, of course, we heard that the Jatiya Party of General Ershad has pulled out, saying that the country is on the brink of disaster. The BNP, of course, today have talked about postponing the polls and asked for that. I like actually the way that somebody described the current situation as a single-party farce, the elections going ahead without without any opponents. And we've already got members of the government really elected unopposed because nobody's standing against them. I'm surprised, actually, as a journalist, that there's so little media coverage about Bangladesh at the moment, and I think this has been a problem throughout the year. We've had Navi Pillay, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, talking about political brinkmanship driving Bangladesh to the edge, talking about shocking levels of violence. But we're really not seeing that picked up enough, and the warning signs have been there throughout the year. I think one of the things that's really bothered, really been destructive for many people, is the degree of hartal, of blockades, of unrest going on at the moment. And it's notable that at the moment we're in the middle of a 131-hour blockade in Dhaka. I mean, that's extraordinary. That means people can't run their businesses, children can't go to school, do their exams. And we've, of course, got the garment factory manufacturers going to the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, begging them to do something about this. We've seen reports of more than 50 dead in 5 weeks, garment factory trucks being set on fire on the way to Chittagong, and some very nasty methods being used, gunpowder and petrol bombs causing burn injuries, which of course are of great concern. So the amount of human loss of life is quite shocking. And the long-term damage of these hartal was something that I tried to look at in terms of Bangladesh when I was researching earlier this year, and I found actually there's no record of how many hartal there were in the past on which days. The numbers don't add up and don't match, especially if you start to distinguish between provincial and national ones. So if you actually want to look at the past and how much economic damage there might have been as a result of hartal and now, it's quite difficult because the data simply isn't there. You can estimate how much loss of investment, how much one day's stoppage might cause, but it's very difficult to even get the numbers from the past and compare. My paper was really about the Islamic parties, about political Islam, but I felt that actually looking at election performance, so the number of votes, particularly when looking at Jamaat-e-Islami, the main party, was not really telling you the full picture. So one of the issues I looked at was the kind of some indicators for a general, what I called Islamization at a grassroots level in Bangladeshi society since I lived there in 96, 98. And I looked at a couple of things. I looked at the education system, the treatment of minorities and women, and the NGO sector very briefly. I found it very difficult in that case to get much information. In terms of education, what I saw was obviously a mushrooming of madrasas, including many female ones, which was a surprise to me. A huge exponential growth of female madrasa from 8 to 52% over 18 years in terms of enrolment of girls. And I think that was to do with a positive discrimination program brought in by the government to encourage enrolment of girls in Alia madrasa, in state-run madrasa or state-approved madrasa. In terms of the numbers of madrasa, I mean, it was quite shocking to me actually that there were no reliable statistics for how many children were enrolled in madrasa, Alia or Qawmi madrasa, the either type. There were estimates of 10 million children enrolled, but I think in the end we felt that it was more likely to be somewhere near 4 million children in 19,000 madrasa, and the majority of those in primary madrasa, primary level ones. We collected multiple data sources in an attempt to get somewhere nearer the truth, and we put them all in the appendix of the report so that people could look at them. Clearly there were some instances where there was an incentive to inflate the numbers, to gain more prominence, more political clout. The other thing that was really surprising to me was that the reasons for attending madrasa as opposed to the mainstream school system, in some cases maybe growing religiosity, but also many people cited the failure of the state system. So the fact that children or families would be forced to pay informal fees, sort of bribes, extra money to the teachers. And the other thing that was interesting was that many of the madrasa teachers seemed to send their children to mainstream educational schools if they possibly could, because they knew that the job opportunities would be better. So it struck me that really sending your child to a madrasa, whichever kind of madrasa, was not necessarily a choice, but more something that people felt they had no choice about. As you may be aware if you follow Bangladesh, one of the issues that's been going kind of simmering this year is the issue of government recognition for the Qawmi madrasa sector, so for the certification that they issue. So I guess you're probably fairly familiar with the systems, but the Alia madrasa is more generally sort of ideologically aligned to Jamaat, and it's a recognised government system where if you get a qualification at the end, it's recognised in terms of university entrance and so on by the state. And the Qawmi madrasa are unrecognised, unregulated, and vary enormously in what they produce at the end. But certainly my female researcher who went into a Qawmi madrasa for girls and herself wore hijab and was pretty devout was absolutely shocked by what she found inside one of them, and just shocked by the way that young girls were treated even in a very segregated environment, and what they were taught and how little freedom they had. And I think that's also quite surprising that a Bangladeshi young woman and a university graduate would simply not know what's happening inside a Qawmi madrasa in a provincial town and not realise that's how women were being treated. As I mentioned, the Awami League, ironically perhaps because if you see them as secular, set up a commission last year to negotiate with the Qawmi madrasa chiefs, as it were, in terms of recognising their qualification. And of course many Bangladeshis, especially university academics I spoke to, were extremely concerned about this. They felt that there would be an influx of Qawmi educated students into the state system and that would be a disaster. And they said that already they were struggling with madrasa educated students from the Alia madrasa sector, and they were finding it very difficult to have free and frank and open discussions about Islamic issues because they themselves perhaps were not as well educated in the subject as their students, and they found it difficult to talk about these things in class. Clearly the reason why the Awami League is doing this is it's a sort of bargaining tool, and there's quite a lot of criticism from many academics about the Awami League making too many concessions to the Islamists. I looked in my study at the proposal which the Qawmi Madrasa body had put to the government. Some of the suggestions were quite worrying. Women should be educated in full purdah on segregated premises, but also the kind of slant was very much that they should be educated to be good mothers, and that was about it. So I think that was something that a lot of Bangladeshi women wouldn't agree with as a slant, shall we say. I also looked at some detail at the treatment of religious minorities as a way of gauging kind of intolerance. But it's not only that. I think I would draw your attention to the recent work of Amnesty International, which looked at some of the attacks on Hindus in Bangladesh in the spring and found that actually, contrary to what you might expect, it wasn't only Islamic parties or Islamic groups or vigilantes involved in this. In the second wave of attacks on Hindu temples or areas, it was quite often members of all the parties, different parties, BNP or Awami League, involved in looting. So they spread the blame quite roundly on everyone, in a sense. Again, data hard to find. We tried to find a list of all the attacks on Hindu houses and temples this year, looking at Bengali and English media sources. Clearly there was a huge wave after the 28th of February sentencing of Saidi. There's no doubt that it was the worst wave since 2001. A lot of people questioned why India had been quite muted in its response to that, and they assumed that was because it was an Awami League government under which this was happening. We found 130 incidents reported in the media in 70 days in the spring, and everybody expects more if there are elections. And of course there's recently been an incident involving the distribution of a Facebook page allegedly insulting Islam, used to incite violence against Hindus. And I think at this point it's worth mentioning that social and digital media have been misused increasingly in Bangladesh to incite violence, and we saw that with the attacks on Buddhists last year, and also with the issue of Saidi's face being seen on the moon. That was a simple Photoshop job, but the police said they really struggled to contend with that, and they ended up having to Photoshop a famous Bangladeshi actor's face onto the moon and fax the picture to various police stations to convince their young officers and policemen that it was possible to do this. So, I mean, I'm not sure how long that trick will last, but you'll have to get more sophisticated, but clearly it does work at the moment, and it is a matter of concern. We also tried to compile a list of attacks on Ahmadiyya, and there is a long list that we came up with in the back of the book. In terms of looking at issues to do with women, I mean, obviously, I think you'll be aware that there's striking successes in terms of economic development, but these are not necessarily translated into greater say or empowerment or power in terms of political power. We find it very difficult to get even basic data on how many women candidates were nominated in elections, and we found that even on the Election Commission site there were different numbers, contradictory numbers for how many women have been elected in various places. So again, data very, very difficult in order to analyse. We sent one of the female researchers into a village to look at boycotted, the Jamaat political sessions amongst women, and the Talim, the religious classes that go on in villages. And that was, only one village and very subjective, but it was quite interesting in terms of the kind of changing attitudes that she saw in that village, or two villages actually connected. Much more wearing of burqa, much more concern about microcredit as opposed to finance, as in usury, and a lot more concern about paying zakat. So she felt that at a certain level it was making women a lot more aware about Islam, and some of them much more aware about political Islam, not all of these classes obviously. and there was sort of division amongst the women about whether they would vote the way their husbands told them. Some of them were more Islamic in a way than their husbands, and some of them were saying that it's my duty to vote, to do what my husband says, and others were saying, no, I'll vote for Jamaat or whoever it is because I'll think for myself. So it was kind of interesting. Again, we tried to look at some of the issues to do with Islam, with NGOs and Islamic ones, and found that very difficult. I mean, it's a very grey area where money comes in from abroad, and the only thing I can really say about that is that it became apparent that the NGO Bureau, which is in charge of supervising incoming foreign funding for NGOs, simply isn't up to the job. I mean, can't do it because they have thousands and thousands, of NGOs to monitor. And, I think there's real concerns about the civil service being infiltrated by, Jamaat supporters. We found that the peasants' wing of the Jamaat, Chashir Kolyon Samiti, they had been registered as an NGO and were receiving money from abroad, and yet potentially that money could be used to, buy agricultural equipment for their voters in the election. And yet women's NGOs said it was very difficult for them to get registered. So I think that's kind of a matter of concern, and it's very difficult to chart the spread of that money. I mean, the NGO Bureau director said he had no kind of resources in the provinces to monitor what happens. So when you think how much money is coming in and how little resources he had, even if he wanted to do it, it would be very difficult, aside from the politicisation of the civil service issue. In terms of Jamaat, I found actually quite surprising that a lot of Bangladeshis I spoke to, especially the more maybe secular ones, to put a label on them, assumed that all the Islamists were more or less the same. And so I think, the situation is very fluid, and at times you have different Islamic groups with different ideology obviously coming together and rallying around a particular issue, but there are obviously clear doctrinal differences and actually power struggle. So I think there was a sense that some of the smaller Islamic groups saw that Jamaat had been very successful in winning a lot of space given its size and having a lot of influence, and they thought, okay, maybe we should also have some of that clout. I looked particularly at Jamaat, at its membership, its organisation, its funding and politics, and I found it obviously difficult to say how many members they have, but they say they have 30,000 full members and somewhere between 3/4 and 1 million workers. We got hold of one of the personal report cards, which aspirant members have to fill in, which was very interesting to me at least. If you're a Jamaat aspirant member, if you joined, you have to go through kind of several years going to documenting every week how many times you went to the mosque, how many times you invited other people to join the movement, but how many times you prayed, what religious books you studied. So there's quite a heavy-duty sort of educational program, and it's charted in this booklet, which we put in our book and translated into English because it was quite fascinating to see how that works. We also managed to get hold of a chap from Chatra Shibir, I'm being told I've got to hurry up, who talked about how he was recruited, which was extremely interesting. I guess just looking politically, I mean, it's obvious that the issue with the war crimes trial, which I think Kamal will talk about more, has been an unprecedented crisis for the party. But one of the things I did note was that there were some younger members of the party who were talking about reform and even questioning why they were still so pro-Pakistan, talking about whether they should reorient vis-a-vis India. It's very, very hard as an outsider to know how influential those people are. I think they conceded themselves they were a minority, but they were a younger generation, and it's notable that probably 70% of the party members were born after 1971, and so they may not want to carry that baggage into the future. Clearly, one of the big issues and big unknowns is, if there are executions of the Jamaat leaders, it doesn't look likely that will happen before the elections now. If the elections are on January the 5th, who knows? There is some concern, and BNP people were saying this too, that it could that party leaders could lose control of some of the more radical grassroots elements. It could push them into more extremism or even militancy, and there is a track record in the past, in the mid-2000s, when some Jamaat members who were not happy with the direction of the party went into militancy and left it. So I think there's quite a concern there. And of course there's a real risk now of Jamaat finding common cause with other Islamists against the government. Very briefly, I tried to document funding of Jamaat. It's clear that party supporters control huge business interests in Bangladesh now: hospitals, universities, banks, schools. And I charted, I won't go into it in detail because you can read it, but I charted the links between some of these organisations and companies and foundations in terms of shared directors with clear Jamaat links. And it extended to university boards and also coaching centres, which are quite important in terms of recruitment and bringing people into universities. So we also managed to find some of the Jamaat links there, so I urge you to go and have a look at that. In the interest of kind of speeding up, I mean, clearly, we've had two new forces this year, the Shahbag movement and Hafazat coming on the streets. I think, just to summarise, what we're seeing is, in a way, the two sides, the Islamic side, and obviously there are huge differences between them, but they are coming together, pitted against secularists. And I was quite surprised, actually, to find that, even journalists who might have been more neutral in the past really felt they had to take sides this time. They felt that, their names were on death lists, they wouldn't survive in a Bangladesh run under the next, under the opposition if they came to power, if they were in alliance with Jamaat, and they felt that, and a lot of civil servants as well, they didn't feel that they had to be neutral anymore. They felt that it was a question of taking a side, and that I think is really worrying, actually, because it also cuts across the civil service as well. So why has this kind of awful conflict got to this point? I mean, I think in a way we're talking about the failure of the mainstream parties, the fact that they have failed so badly in terms of finding alternative space, that the Islamists are potentially getting more and more space than they might do given their electoral strength in the past.
Excellent. Thank you, Francis. Can I turn to Kamal, please?
Thank you. To date, it seems that the government headed by the current Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is determined to proceed with this election plan, time frame stipulated in the constitutional amendment. That amendment she brought in. She brought in this amendment by overruling the recommendations made by a committee of the parliamentary group formed for this specific purpose, and ignoring judicial observation that the next two general elections can be held under a caretaker system. In mid-November, Sheikh Hasina formed an all-party government, only in name. In reality, this simply involved forming a cabinet from an alliance of parties she has been leading since 2006. It's not only her opponent Khaleda Zia who has stayed away from the all-party government. Sheikh Hasina's former allies like Communist Party of Bangladesh or Gano Forum and some other smaller liberal groups, they are also not taking part in the elections under her terms. The deadline for submission of nomination papers closed yesterday, and if this election without participation of a major political party, the BNP, happens, then it will result in sort of more protests, more violence, and an uncertain future for the country. Because past records show that BNP consistently got votes between 35 to 40% in last 4 elections. So you cannot keep a sizable number of voters representative out of the election. Also, the latest development today is that the one of the key ally of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina so far or till to date, General Ershad, has decided to pull out from the election. Though still there are question marks because his colleagues are still in the cabinet. They have not been ordered to resign. So still, I think he is trying to do some more bargaining or get some better terms from the lady in the power. Prime Minister Hasina's insistence for following the constitutional path and Khaleda Zia's continuous refusal to accept any election under Sheikh Hasina at the helm have already caused more than 30 deaths. And today, again, I think more than 5 people have died since this morning till midday. So it looks quite ugly. The use of petrol bombs and arson has spread widespread panic in the country. Blockades and hartals are hurting people in the countryside more than the capital. And insecurity and uncertainty about the country's future have gripped the nation. Though Bangladesh is known to have a very vibrant and proactive civil society, their voices have been largely ignored. They have been marginalized. In Bangladesh, the state has remained the principal source for dispensation of patronage, and the electoral system has produced winner-takes-all democracy. The two major parties, the Awami League and the BNP, have used and abused resources in the past for personal gains and in order to maintain the party machines and their hold over the party activists. This system also breeds high level of corruption, and the state provides impunity to the members of the party in power. It allows the ruling party to use the state machinery for reprisals against the opposition. In the absence of accountable and functioning institutions, the politicization of the civil service and the judiciary became the norm under successive governments. Changes in the government mean changes in the whole of the administration. Records show both these parties consistently outdo each other on this respect. This culture makes an election a survival issue for both the parties. According to Professor Ali Riaz of Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington, both the incumbents and opposition view winning the election is their only safeguard against possible threats after the election. None of them can afford the high cost of defeat. That's why since 1991, the incumbents have attempted to change the rules of the game in their favor, and the current government is no exception. Legacies of Bangladesh's turbulent and often bloody history also have contributed to this complicated political rivalry. Sheikh Hasina and a good number of Awami League supporters believe that the founder of Khaleda Zia's BNP, former military ruler General Zia, was somehow responsible for the killing of her father Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. This distrust had turned the political rivalry into personal hatred and enmity. This distrust deepened further on the 21st of August 2004, the day when an attempt was made on Hasina's life at a public meeting in Dhaka. She survived, but a number of her associates and senior leaders have died. Khaleda Zia's eldest son, Tariq Rahman, who now lives in the UK, has been indicted for this attack. Similarly, Khaleda Zia's eviction from her late husband's house inside the military cantonment was seen by the BNP as a personal vendetta. These developments make any reconciliation between these two ladies almost impossible, and their heirs apparent are still far away from successions. Alternative parties are unlikely to emerge as victorious in the upcoming election. In terms of share of votes, former military dictator General Ershad's Jatiyo Party has consistently maintained the third position in the table. But the general is too old, and his inconsistencies in policies and actions have exposed his opportunistic character, which makes his party less acceptable to the wider public. A number of serious criminal prosecutions are pending against the general, and he has to be loyal to the person in power. Some left and liberal parties do occasionally voice moral positions on critical issues, but their electoral performance are very poor. This is why most voters have alternated between the BNP and the Awami League. The socio-economic policies of both the parties are similar. Both parties are committed to promoting an open market, supporting private sector, welcoming foreign investment, extending social safety nets to vulnerable groups, and providing free education up to secondary level. But the dividing line is based on emotional values. The Awami League is seen as upholding the spirits of war of independence, and the BNP for leaving the past behind. There is also a popular notion that the Awami League is a secular party, while the BNP prefers an Islamic national identity. It is true that the BNP has been founded on Bangladeshi nationalism, which is based on the religious identity of the majority people of the country. It also promised equal rights to the minority. When this party was founded, it emerged as a broader coalition of various political groups from a wide spectrum of politics, from the extreme left to the extreme right. Opponents of the Awami League found a new platform in the BNP, including those who were against the liberation war or collaborated with the Pakistani forces. However, in more recent years, the BNP and its coalition partner Jamaat have been accused of large-scale attacks against minorities. For example, in 2001, Hindus were attacked due to the perception of their natural support to the Awami League. Despite its public image of a secular force, the ruling Awami League is also accused of playing opportunistic politics with minority groups. Under the stewardship of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the Awami League founded the Islamic Foundation to promote Islamic values, which supported preaching and religious education. He also sought membership of the Organization of Islamic Conference. One in-depth research by a Dhaka University professor, economist Abul Barakat, shows that Awami League activists are responsible for more than 2/3 of minority property grabs. The state minister in charge of policing has been accused of masterminding the most recent attack on some minority homes in the northern district of Pabna by his fellow party members and also by the chairman of the National Human Rights Commission. Despite the serious nature of the accusations, he has been retained in the smaller so-called all-party cabinet. Investigations carried out by senior experts of Amnesty International from the UK found out that in February, in the coastal district of Noakhali, Hindu families came under attack successively by activists from Jamaat, then the Awami League, then the BNP. The Awami League also cannot claim to be immune from political Islam. Its relations with Islamist politics are not at all that transparent, rather opportunistic and confusing. It quoted Jamaat-e-Islami in 1995-96 against the BNP to mount a campaign of street agitation demanding a constitutional amendment to have the provision of a non-party caretaker government for conducting elections. Last September, Prime Minister, in response to a question about Jamaat, told a news conference in New York that as a politician, she could not think of banning a political party. Jamaat is still a legal political party, but due to a court ruling, the Election Commission cannot register it as a party that are eligible for certain benefits like a national symbol or broadcast facility on the state media. In recent weeks, several leading officials of the Awami League made public statements inviting Jamaat supporters to join the Awami League. The Awami League's even more opportunistic policy has been reflected in its handling of madrasa education. It is the Awami League who has encouraged madrasa teachers to form a Qawmi board to streamline their curricula. Instead of engaging experts on education reform, it entrusted mullahs to regulate themselves, which resulted in the emergence of Hefazat, a pseudo-political group committed to be a very conservative version of Islam. When Hefazat floated its 13-point demands, including regressive measures on women's rights and education, the Prime Minister tried to placate them, saying that her government has implemented most of them, those 13 points, and the rest will be reviewed and considered. But these Islamists have now realized their power and are now bargaining hard with both the BNP and the Awami League for greater share of the pie. Many observers believe that faced with hostilities from Jamaat and the BNP, the Awami League wanted to find some allies amongst Islamists, and their strategy had backfired. Some of those observers also say that the Awami League has still not given up on Hefazatis and maintains regular contacts with them. In 2006, Awami League signed a coalition deal with an Islamist organization that they had to abandon in the face of widespread opposition from a number of women's and civil rights organizations. It has been alleged by the Awami League that the BNP and Jamaat are opposing the elections to thwart the trials currently underway to try those accused of war crimes during the independence war of 1971. There may be some truth in this. However, it could also be argued that when most of the opinion polls predict a BNP sweep to power, it would be much easier for the BNP to take part in elections, try to win, and then order a review of the whole trial process, citing suspicions about the integrity of the trial process as their reason. Trying the war criminals was an election promise of the Awami League, but their refusal of international expertise has led to doubts about the fairness of the trial within the international community. Although there is widespread support both within the country and abroad for bringing in the perpetrators to justice, the widespread violence carried out by the Jamaat activists in response to the trials raises serious security concerns. The BNP have remained silent about what they would do about the trial if they were voted into power. What are the likely outcomes of the current political impasse? Mounting international pressure could force both these feuding parties to enter into a dialogue. The UN Secretary General's special envoy is expected to visit Dhaka on the 6th of December to encourage both the parties to find an amicable solution. The EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Catherine Ashton, on Saturday made a direct appeal for a mutually acceptable formula to hold an inclusive, fair, and credible election. Ms. Ashton is the first foreign high official calling for finding an amicable formula. India is sending her foreign secretary to Dhaka on the 5th of December. All this international pressure may bring some positive results. If not, then the ongoing electoral process will continue, which may fulfill the constitutional requirement but produce a weaker mandate to the current ruling party. Unfortunately, history shows that previous parliaments that were formed through elections where the opposition boycotted, the process did not last long. There are two other possible scenarios. First, something similar to 2007, an army-backed interim administration. And the second, a full-scale military takeover. Recent developments in Egypt may encourage some officers that military rule can also be accepted by Western governments as a matter of unavoidable necessity, especially where a potential threat of Islamic uprising is a real possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Let me start by asking the first question, and then I'll open the floor for questions and comments by others. Both Francis and Kamal, I mean, both of you have talked about the sort of the polarization that's taking place in Bangladesh, in terms of Jamaat, of course, and as well as in terms of the mainstream political parties. But what I'd like to focus on is the sort of the run up to the elections. Now, just suppose that international pressure is not able to deliver some sort of moderating influence on the Awami League today. What does this mean for the actual election on the 5th of January? And the Awami League feels that it will continue with the election on the 5th of January, whatever the case. Now, can there be a sort of, is it possible to have a shutdown of Bangladesh on that day so people are not able to vote? Is that possible for the BNP to do to ensure that in terms of numbers of people voting, it will be relatively limited? You've talked about a figure of about 35 to 40% of voters voted for the BNP in the last election. Kamal, I mean, if that is the case, then clearly you will have the day after the elections a problem in terms of the total amount of votes, which will bring into question the credibility, of course, of the election and the government in that sense. But if there is greater voting or greater voting clearly for the Awami League in this case, then that becomes a more difficult issue. That's one part. The second part is the military aspect, and I'd like both of you to respond to this. You've talked about concerns over military intervention in that sense. What is today the role of the Bangladesh military on these issues? Because in a way, there's been a sort of an attempt to sideline the military from politics for the last few years. But does the military still have the capability, the ability to actually intervene and be seen then to be doing or sort of coming in for a public good in that sense?
Well, on the first point, I think in the past also, elections happened even despite opposition boycotts. So election can be held, and participation of party supporters will be quite significant. They will try to shore up number of voters, but I doubt that it will cross 40 or 50% of the threshold, because common people are quite frustrated. They're frustrated because lack of governance over last 5 years, because several other issues. So why do they take risk for giving Awami League support to the through ballots, taking risks of these petrol bombs, arsoning, or all sorts of shutdowns? Shutdowns are going to continue. There's no doubt about it. And the country, when I was there last week in Dhaka, Dhaka was totally cut off from rest of the country. So on election day, if this kind of scenario continues, rest of the country, there won't be much of elections. Jatiyo Party candidates, at least 70 of them told General Ershad that they couldn't file nomination papers because lack of security. Awami League candidates also, I think at least 4 or 5 candidates had to use helicopters to go to their constituency to file nomination papers. So communication is chaotic, very disruptive life, and I don't think people will turn up in huge numbers to take part in this election. So that will be a weaker mandate, whatever the number is. Election will be there, but a weaker mandate. The other question about the army. Generally, army is reluctant to intervene in politics anymore because of their interest of keeping the international image for peacekeeping, for all the praise, etc., etc. So they are reluctant. But for how long? If government has to impose emergency for holding elections because of worsening law and order situation and deploy army, then you never know or which way that will lead to.
I think the same thing on the army I heard again and again from people in the spring and summer was that they felt the army didn't want to get involved at all. The kind of thing people said to me was, who would want to try and run this country with all the problems? It's very difficult. And yes, the issue of UN peacekeeping jobs and the image of the country was, clearly an issue they felt for the military. There was no sense in which it was, poised, wanting to come in at all. But obviously that could change if things get very seriously out of control. Clearly an election without any opposition is problematic in terms of credibility, especially if you have people actually being elected unopposed. I think there are sort of concerns about law and order and actually policing and controlling the areas. Kamal talked about the problems for candidates actually filing their nominations, but if you look at the spring after Saidi's verdict, the police say that there were quite large areas where they lost control and they couldn't get reinforcements in because there were, barricades across the roads, and that's quite worrying. Hopefully they've learned from that and that won't happen again, but when you have a breakdown in law and order on that scale, if it happens again, that could be, of great concern. Because it was quite a large area of the country.
Great, thank you. Well, the floor is open for questions or comments. Yes, if you could identify yourself before asking a question or making a comment, please.
I'm Prashant Barwa, teaching law. I'm also from Brahman. First question to Francis. Actually, thank you to both of you. This report is balanced with some additional criticism on Awami League from Mr. Kamal, but I appreciate that. Do you think there is an ideological crackdown on the values and norms of the civil society and the workers of the political party? Because I have seen in some cases, as you mentioned about the Shatia, some cases institute of all-party resistance against the atrocities on the minorities. In some cases, all-party participation is now visible, especially in the grassroots level. And in 2001, many scholars declined to sign a statement against religious atrocities in Bangladesh after the election. And also Chittagong Hill track that is not actually mentioned here. Even girl raped in Chittagong and killed brutally. The people in capital, they don't bother for even giving one statement or a protest. So I think an election, however it is widely participated or not, is not the only and immediate answer to the gravity of the danger that emerges in Bangladesh society. So institutions are not working. Judicial mechanism to address this problem is absent. And so my question or observation is that I believe Bangladesh deserves more assistance, advice, whatever, from inside or outside, not only for the election. Election is not answer. Kamal correctly pointed it takes all by the winner. And also the democratic secular mechanisms not working. Institutions not functional, like press club, BMA, Supreme Court bar, they are functional in even ages. And also a question to Kamal. Kamal, do you still think, despite limitations, opportunistic steps, still Awami League is the best hope to fight back, to hold a secular resistance against all odd and a future danger? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Francis, do you want to go first and then Kamal?
Yes, perhaps. I think one of the things that was shocking actually for me was somebody I met anonymously who said that they thought that actually Pakistan was better off now in the sense that its judiciary was still, relatively robust, and that Bangladesh, that wasn't the case, that everything was politicised, the police, the civil service, all the various institutions, including they were concerned about the judiciary. So yes, obviously elections are not the fix-all, but they are putting huge pressure on the system, because obviously it is a winner-takes-all kind of zero-sum game approach in Bangladesh, and it's that and the war crimes trial together, have made things very inflamed in that sense. But I think it's the other way around. If you don't have a credible election, it will make things worse, rather than the election necessarily solving all the problems.
Well, I can add just only one thing, that yes, a dialogue is needed, national dialogue on broader issues, not just only election. It is a shameful thing that these attacks on minorities in Ramu, in Cox's Bazar, in several other places are participated by all sorts of political parties. It's just not Jamaat-e-Islami alone or those usual suspects alone. So there is a
Ideological crackdown.
well, you need some sort of social contract, renewal of social contract, peace, rights of every sort of vulnerable groups, women, that has to be included in the discussions and negotiations, not just election.
But is there, if I can just come in, is there something more or equally important, which is the sort of the differences between the two women? I mean, how the two ladies, how do you, the dialogue, the absence of a dialogue, I think they met only once or twice in the last 5 years, if at all. But I mean, what is the essence for this? Because in a way, it's a fairly unique situation that you have these two very powerful political leaders with strong family backgrounds, and but why aren't they talking to each other?
I mean, it is a disgrace that a country that has so much going for it, potentially, like Bangladesh, the social indicators are positive, really positive, and against all the odds, it's very entrepreneurial. The garment sector is doing, would be doing brilliantly if it were not being held back by its politics, and it's been the same sort of story for 2 decades almost. And the fact that this animosity between these two women, who really don't differ substantially on political, ideological grounds. I mean, not hugely. Foreign policy, trade, economic policy, it's not that different. It's absolutely shocking that this can be hold a country to ransom, really. And there's no third option.
I agree totally. That's completely personal. There's nothing sort of in terms of policy issues, running the country, how to sort of formulate different strategy or policy or foreign relations. There's not much difference.
And when you're looking for a way out of it, I mean, you mentioned international pressure, but I'm not sure there is going to be that much leverage or that much desire to put pressure. I don't know.
There are clearly two issues, whether there is a desire on the part of the international community, and the other is whether they can effectively do something. Yes, I suspect there's not much desire on the part of the international community. If there is a desire, probably they can do something, because trade, aid, and all sorts of relations are there where you can use your leverage.
Well, you still have countries like China investing where there's less leverage, and possibly the desire or the awareness of what's going on won't really mount until the media really gets hold of it, it has not happened substantially, international media, and probably won't until it gets extremely bad.
Well, there's several other questions. Let me start with Kiran, and then please, if you identify, and then I'll take the others.
I'm Khaleda Zia. I'm from the IIS. Francis, my question is to you and also to Mr. Kamal. I was wondering, you mentioned international media, the role of international media. Could you just actually mention Bangladeshi media, the national as well as the private media? How are they actually, because if you compare it to other countries in South Asia, the media perhaps in other South Asian countries plays a far more of kind of proactive role. I was wondering if that is the case in Bangladesh, in the pre-election kind of scenario, because you mentioned social media.
Yes, let me just take the second question, then we can, because there'll be more. Yes, please.
Yes, you mentioned my name is William Crawley from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. You mentioned the increased polarization, absolutist polarization in Bangladesh between the two parties. And yet you mentioned also the way, as in Pakistan, I think there's a parallel here in which both which both the quote secular parties have to some extent absorbed as far as they can Islamic ideology and teachings, insofar as they can within their own constituencies. My question really is to what extent, with the increasing polarization within the Islamic parties, and which is perhaps more in Bangladesh than in Pakistan because of the greater Sufi-based traditions and the perhaps stronger resistance to the Salafi influences coming from outside than there is in Pakistan, that this polarization within Islam is surely affecting the way in which both the other parties cooperate and as I said, absorb Islamic teachings, and also the willingness of the public to accept it.
Francis, do you want to start first?
Okay. Yes, I mentioned social media, and I mentioned it in the context of being misused to stir trouble. But in terms of the Bangladeshi media, I mean, I think it was notable to me how many of my colleagues there had various kinds of threats or harassment in doing their jobs because of what they were reporting, and how under pressure they felt. And some of them had not reported it to any organisation or even to their editors. And I would be sitting there saying, go and tell your boss, and they'd be like, what's the point? There's nothing we can do. So it really meant that, you know, amongst the English-speaking kind of more secular press, there were quite a few people who felt that, you know, if the government changed, they would have to leave the country if it was a BNP Jamaat. I mean, several people said that to me, which is obviously problematic if you're trying to report an environment like that where you're almost part of the story in terms of what's going to happen. It's difficult to maintain a degree of neutrality. And I think the reporting that I saw of the Shahbag movement at first was you know, quite emotive, quite, I mean, you might say one-sided. It was certainly not the way you would do it in the BBC. And I think that people got quite carried away and supportive of it. And okay, newspapers have editorial policies, but I think the reporting quite often was somewhat partial or emotional about these things, and that's, you know, problematic from my perspective when people are, you know, it is a matter of life and death for some of the reporters, so it is very difficult to judge them, but it makes it very difficult to stand in the middle then. And then William's question, I mean, you talked about, I'm not quite sure I understood it completely, but I think, you know, apart from the polarisation of the main political parties alongst personality, you know, clearly there are massive divisions between the Islamic groups, but the genius of what happened in the spring was that I think probably with Jamaat involvement, they managed to convince Hafazat, who are not a natural ally, that Islam needed defending and was under threat from the bloggers. And I mean, the bloggers weren't, in fact, the bloggers, interestingly, weren't very much defended by journalists. They didn't see this common cause in terms of freedom of expression. They just thought they were bloggers and we're journalists, which is interesting. But, you know, the fact that the government, the Awami League government, gave in to that pressure and demand and arrested 4 of them, and arrested them with their laptops and notebooks spread out in front of them, as you would do with a militant with their guns and weapons, which was quite extraordinary, you know, was a major concession and in a sense gave in. So I think this kind of giving in, making concessions can have unexpected consequences of, you know, empowering those who complain if they see their demands are met. And I think in a way the same thing by giving in to the demand of the Shahbag movement for a right to appeal against a too moderate sentence, as it were, to impose a higher sentence in the War Crimes Tribunal, effectively left a situation where if, you know, the highest court in the land finds that awards the death penalty, there's no recourse for appeal anymore. So actually you can impose the death penalty without a right of appeal, which is shocking and ought to be a matter of concern. And it was very surprising to me too that in a way the people in the Shahbag movement were the sort of secular, moderate kind of people who normally are anti-death penalty in the West, and yet they were, you know, baying for the death penalty there. And when you confronted people about that, they're just like, you don't understand, it's different, it's, you know, we don't believe in the death penalty for criminals, but this is different. So, you know, that's also, I find that very difficult to understand into.
Do you want to add anything to it?
Well, not much. Just one thing is that it's similar to Egypt. Like when we question this ideological polarization, Islamists will be under one umbrella, and on the other side, the liberals and left or Awami League, they will be on the other side. So this polarization will further sort of take serious shape. and whether it might be at some point you have to decide that whether democracy is good or Islamist forces should be sort of tackled as a priority.
And I guess another way of looking at that is that, you have, people describe Bangladeshi politics to me like this, that you have the Awami League and then you have all the anti-Awami League forces, including the BNP.
Yes.
They're kind of for and against, and so obviously the anti-ones can sometimes ally and sometimes not, and that's the kind of issue, isn't it?
Okay, let me take the next batch of 4 questions, then we'll have to end. I know the others want to ask, but let me start with Antoine.
Antoine Director of Bangladesh. So, we've already spoken about the role of a potential role for foreign countries. Could we get a little more specific, and is there some sort of role for the US and for India?
Yes, please, if you identify yourself.
I'm Bhavin Vyas, South Asia analyst for Risk Advisory. I recently went to Dhaka just a few weeks ago, and there's people I spoke to, including journalists and diplomats. They agreed that the military doesn't seem keen on intervening at this point. But there were a couple of people who were close to the government who felt that the violence is escalating to such a level, and it's being done on purpose, particularly by the BNP and Jamaat, who are paying off people to create this violence in order to facilitate an environment where either international pressure happens or military intervention happens. Is that something that you agree with? Is that something that you've seen?
Sure. Account Bailey.
So, I'm Account Bailey from Indian High Commission. Just to, while you mentioned about international pressure and what our colleague asked you to amplify, it's just an opinion that for any progressive country, for a long-lasting solution, it's my opinion that the solutions are better found within the country, and probably there have not been many examples of external intervention and then peace prevailing ever after. So, if BNP, if let's say the solution has to be sorted out within the country, then what kind of model is BNP ready to offer, in the sense that what caretaker government, I mean, who will govern the country in the meanwhile, and then the elections are held? Where will they find these people from, and I mean, how will the system work? What are they really offering?
And the last one, and then Jennifer.
Thank you. Jennifer Harbison, South Asia Consultancy. I guess I'm interested in looking a little bit sort of longer term. I mean, eventually the two ladies will, in the fullness of time, go their way. What happens? What happens after? What's the succession look like? Are there any prospects for some reconciliation? Is the next generation looking a little bit more reasonable or less politicised? And given that the ladies aren't particularly young, how urgent is the thinking that's going on about what happens after their departure?
Thank you. I'm sorry for the others that I haven't been able to include, but we need to end in the next 5 or 6 minutes. So, who would like to go first? Come on, you want?
I can start on some of them.
Okay, and then Kamal can.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can jump in. On the point about instigating violence to the point that there's either foreign pressure or military intervention, yeah, that's the kind of thing I also heard even earlier this year, that people were saying they'd rather have the military take over than the other one, which is, really shocking. The next generation, I mean, a lot of people also said to me that this election, if it happens, will possibly be the last time that some of the Awami League leaders, for example, the older ones in the 71 generation, will contest. So there is a big issue, not just with the two leaders, but with some of the others as to the new generation that might come in. Do you want to talk? I mean, Tariq is the obvious BNP successor, and there's so many problems associated with that. Do you want to talk about Awami League? Because I don't see any obvious successor.
Well, yes. We know about BNP successor, as Francis mentioned. Awami League, it's still not clear, because Sheikh Hasina's son is likely to be the successor, but his acceptability is still in doubts, and that's why a couple of other people are being also groomed, like Sheikh Hasina's other sisters, Rehana's son especially, Bobby. He has been flown into Bangladesh now and is trying to sort of take some role in the campaigning. So probably that indicates that they are not confident at all on succession line. So that's a critical question. It's not clear at all till to date. But it's not going to the out of the family, beyond the family. It will remain in the family. That's very much likely. It's not open for others to contest and grab. That's very much clear.
On the issue of a caretaker government, how you find a solution inside the country, do you think the Prime Minister stepping down as the executive would be
No,
sufficient?
there's some interesting developments of taking place. One senior BNP advisor to Khaleda Zia actually proposed that the rules of business can be changed by the president. You don't need to recall parliament. If the rules of business changed and the Prime Minister's powers are carved, like she has the power to overrule all the ministers' decisions, that overruling power has to be suspended. Prime Minister's some executive authority has to be suspended, and then BNP will participate in the all-party interim government, subject to their chosen ministries like Home, Defense, Establishment.
They are already offered home.
They offered Home and Establishment also.
Yes, they are offered already.
Probably Defense will not come into play. So if Awami League agrees on that Sheikh Hasina will give up some of her authority, then probably a solution can be found out. So far, there's no positive response or indication from the Prime Minister's office. So that's one possible way out. Apart from that, I don't see there is any other sort of interim solution available at the moment. But it all depends on these two ladies. If they can agree, you are right. In the past, foreigners' involvement didn't work. Sarninian trial, it didn't work. Last time also, in 2007, something foreign mediation behind the scene that didn't produce desired result. So very limited they can do in terms of facilitating this election. But in terms of a sort of proper dialogue on broader issues, social issues, safety of minorities, rights of different groups, they can certainly exert pressure on both the parties. And this lesson needs to be learned, that in 2001 what happened, it can happen again and again and again, unless the administration of the day takes precautionary measure in time. And as Francis said, post to Saidi verdict, violence in February actually shown that how grave the situation was. Several parts of the country were totally cut off. Reinforcements were impossible, virtually impossible. So that kind of scenario can happen again. So government needs to, administration of the day needs to take precaution beforehand. Just responding to the situation is not good enough. The other question, yes, your question that military is not keen and violence is a way to sort of incite them or invite them, create a situation. You cannot rule out that theory. But on the other hand also, because of the WikiLeaks leaked documents, we know that both the ladies wanted that it's better army should take over rather than her opponent. So it's equally true for Hasina and Khaleda. So I don't make any difference on that. And I have already answered, I think, on the succession issue.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion looking at the trends, political trends in Bangladesh and the move towards elections next month. We'll be watching all this very carefully, and we'd like ready to re-examine this issue after the elections if they're held, and in terms of the credibility or otherwise of the government that comes into power. But I'd like to have this moment just like to thank both our speakers, Francis and Kamal, for their comments and the discussion, and thank you very much. I hope you'll join me in thanking them.